The year was 2347, and humanity had spread across 12 star systems. They had built colonies on distant worlds and created ships that could cross the void between stars. Yet in all their travels, they had never found another living soul. The universe seemed empty and cold, a place where humans walked alone among dead rocks and burning suns. Captain Daniel stood on the bridge of the USS Defiant and looked out at the stars. His ship was a monster of steel and fire, nearly 4 kilometers long from bow to stern. The engineers back on Earth called it a TitanClass warship, the largest vessel ever built by human hands. It carried weapons that could crack open moons and shields that could withstand the heat of a star. 12,000 crew members lived and worked within its massive hull, each one trained for battles that had never come. Daniel was a tall man with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much. He had served in the fleet for 30 years, commanding ships of every size. But the Defiant was different. She was built for a war that existed only in the nightmares of military planners, designed to fight enemies that humanity had never met. Some said she was a waste of resources. Others called her humanity's insurance policy against the unknown. Lieutenant Corinne Brooks sat at her station, monitoring the sensors that swept the space around them. She was young and sharp, with a gift for finding patterns in chaos. Her fingers moved across her console as data flowed past her eyes. They were on a routine patrol near the outer colonies, checking for pirates and smugglers who sometimes preyed on cargo ships. It was Corinne who first noticed the signal. She frowned at her screen and ran the data through her filters again. The result was the same. Something was transmitting from beyond the edge of charted space, sending pulses of energy in a pattern that could not be natural. The signal repeated itself every 30 seconds, a sequence of mathematical progressions that screamed of intelligence and purpose. Corinne turned to face her captain. Her voice was steady, but her heart was racing. She told Daniel what she had found and watched his face change as the meaning of her words sank in. After centuries of searching, after countless probes and telescopes and listening posts, humanity had finally found what they had always dreamed of and feared. They were not alone. Daniel ordered the crew to battle stations, not because he expected a fight, but because he believed in being prepared. He contacted Admiral Jack Monroe back on Earth and reported what they had discovered. The Admiral was an old friend, a man who had fought beside Daniel in the colony wars. His face appeared on the lined with age and worry. Jack listened to the report and was silent for a long moment. The weight of the decision pressed down on both men. This was the moment that would change everything, the point where human history would split into before and after. Jack gave the order to investigate but warned Daniel to be careful. They did not know what waited for them in the darkness. Commander Lisa Grant prepared the ship for the jump. She was Daniel's second in command, a woman of iron discipline and quick thinking. She had served with him for 15 years and knew his moods better than anyone. She could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his jaw was set. He was afraid, just like the rest of them, but he would never let it show. The Defiant's engines roared to life and bent the fabric of space around them. Stars stretched into lines of light and then snapped back as the ship emerged in a new location. What they saw made every person on the bridge fall silent. A space station hung before them, larger than any structure humanity had ever built. It orbited a dead star, a brown dwarf that gave off only the faintest glow of heat. Around the station floated hundreds of ships in every shape and size imaginable. Some were sleek and silver, others were bulky and covered in strange growths. None of them looked even slightly human. Daniel felt his mouth go dry. They had found not just one alien species, but what appeared to be dozens of them, all gathered in one place. The scale of it overwhelmed him. Humanity had barely taken its first steps among the stars, and here was proof that others had been walking for far longer. Energy beams swept across the Defiant, scanning her from bow to stern. Alarms rang throughout the ship as the sensors detected the intrusion. Daniel ordered his crew to remain calm and not to power up the weapons. He did not want their first contact with alien life to begin with a misunderstanding. The transmission came moments later. It was rough and broken, as if the speakers were still learning the language, but the words were unmistakably English. A cold voice demanded that they identify themselves or face destruction. The threat was clear, and the Defiant was surrounded by ships that outnumbered her hundreds to one. Daniel stepped forward and opened a channel. He spoke slowly and clearly, introducing himself and his ship. He explained that they came from a world called Earth and that they meant no harm. He said they had followed the signal out of curiosity and hoped to establish peaceful contact. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Then the voice returned, less hostile but still wary. It told them that they had entered the space of something called the Galactic Council, a governing body that ruled over hundreds of species. They were ordered to send a representative to the station for questioning. Daniel looked at Lisa and saw his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. They had come looking for answers and found something far greater than they had imagined. The universe was full of life, and that life had organized itself into a civilization that spanned the galaxy. Humanity was no longer alone, but whether that was good news or bad remained to be seen. He gave the order to prepare a shuttle and began to think about who should speak for all of mankind. The fate of his species might depend on what happened in the next few hours. He hoped they were ready for whatever came next. He hoped humanity was ready. The stars seemed to watch them, cold and distant, offering no comfort and no guidance. Whatever happened now would be written in history books for 1,000 years. Daniel took a deep breath and prepared to meet the universe. The Galactic Council had existed for 50,000 years. It was older than human civilization, older than the pyramids, older than the first cities that rose from the mud of ancient river valleys. 312 species had joined its ranks each one earning their place through diplomacy or strength or simple endurance. They had built an empire that stretched across the galaxy, a web of trade routes and alliances that kept the peace among the stars. High Counselor of the People stood in the great chamber and studied the reports from the border station. His species was ancient and proud, one of the founding members of the council. They had 3 eyes set in a face of pale blue skin, and their bodies were tall and thin like reeds swaying in the wind. Had led the council for 200 years and thought he had seen everything the universe could offer. He was wrong. The alien vessel that had appeared in their space all logic. His analysts had measured it 3 times to be certain of their results. The ship was nearly 4 kilometers long, larger than most council battlecruisers by a factor of 10. Its hull was covered in weapons of unknown design, arrays and turrets that pointed in every direction like the spines of some deep-sea creature. The power readings from its engines suggested capabilities that should not have been possible for such a young species. The humans, as they called themselves, were complete unknowns. They had no entry in the Council's database and no mention in the records of any member species. They had simply appeared from an unexplored region of the galaxy, arriving in a warship that made even the mighty hegemony look small. Summoned an emergency session of the Council. Representatives from every member world gathered in the Great Chamber, a vast hall carved from the heart of an asteroid. The ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top, and the walls were lined with viewing galleries where thousands could watch the proceedings. This was where the fate of civilizations was decided, where wars were declared and peace treaties signed. Ambassador was chosen to speak for humanity. She was a woman of middle age with dark hair and calm eyes that missed nothing. She had spent her life negotiating between rival factions in the human colonies, settling disputes that might otherwise have led to bloodshed. Now, she faced a challenge greater than anything she had ever imagined. The survival of her entire species might depend on the words she chose. The shuttle carried her from the Defiant to the station, passing through a gap in the alien fleet. She looked out the window at the ships surrounding them and felt very small. Each vessel was crewed by beings who had traveled among the stars while her ancestors were still living in caves. The weight of human history seemed to press down on her shoulders. The council chamber took her breath away. Beings of every shape and size filled the galleries, thousands of eyes turning to watch as she walked to the central platform. Creatures clicked their mandibles and whispered to each other in languages that sounded like static. Reptilian diplomats hissed softly, their scales gleaming under the artificial lights. A being made of living gas floated nearby, its form shifting and changing with each passing moment. She had never felt more alone. High Counselor addressed her from his raised seat. His voice was translated by a device she wore around her neck, turning alien sounds into words she could understand. He asked her to explain her presence in council space and to account for the warship she had arrived in. His tone was polite, but there was steel beneath it. Spoke carefully. She explained that humanity had only recently developed the technology to travel between stars. Their home world was located in a distant arm of the galaxy, far from any known trade routes. The Defiant was designed to protect their colonies from threats they had never actually encountered. They had built it out of fear and caution, not aggression. The chamber erupted in murmurs and whispers. A massive creature rose from the section, a being that resembled a bipedal rhinoceros standing 3 meters tall. General commanded the largest military force in the council, and his word carried weight in matters of security. He demanded to know why any species would build such a weapon if they had no enemies to fight. Met his gaze without flinching. She told him that humans had plenty of enemies throughout their history. They had simply all been other humans. Her species had fought countless wars against itself, developing weapons of terrible power long before they reached the stars. The Defiant was simply the latest in a long line of tools built for survival. Was not satisfied. He declared that no peaceful species invested such resources in destruction. He called the humans warmongers and demanded that they surrender their vessel and submit to council inspection. His supporters roared their agreement and the chamber shook with their voices. Counselor called for order. He asked what humanity would do if the council demanded their disarmament. His 3 eyes studied her face, searching for any sign of weakness or deception. The entire chamber fell silent, waiting for her answer. Thought about the 12,000 crew members aboard the Defiant. She thought about the billions of humans back in the colonies who were counting on her. She thought about her children, and in all the generations that might never exist if she made the wrong choice. She told the council that humanity hoped for peace. They had come to the stars looking for friends, not enemies, but she would not lie about who they were. Her people were survivors who had clawed their way up from mud and blood to reach the heavens. If the council wanted peace, humanity would gladly accept it. If the council wanted war, humanity would give them one they would never forget. The silence that followed was deafening. No species had ever spoken to the council in such terms. Even the great powers of the galaxy chose their words with care when addressing this body, but stood alone on that platform and refused to bow. Counselor dismissed the session and told her they would continue tomorrow. As she walked back to her shuttle, she felt the eyes of 1,000 species upon her. She had bought humanity time, but she did not know if it would be enough. The next few days would decide everything. The news of the ultimatum reached Earth within hours. Admiral Jack Monroe read the report 3 times before calling an emergency meeting of the Military Council. The message was clear. The Galactic Council wanted humanity to surrender its greatest weapon or face the consequences. They had given no deadline, but the threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Dr. Samuel Price was summoned from his office at the Academy. He was a historian who had spent decades studying the wars and conflicts that shaped human civilization. His hair was white, and his hands shook slightly with age, but his mind remained sharp as a blade. The military often consulted him when they needed to understand the patterns of the past. Samuel listened to the briefing and asked a simple question. He wanted to know what kind of people these aliens were. Had they ever faced extinction? Had they ever fought for survival against impossible odds? The officers looked at each other in confusion. They did not understand why this mattered. Samuel explained that every species was shaped by its history. Humans were survivors because their world had tried to kill them at every turn. Ice ages had frozen their ancestors. Plagues had wiped out entire populations. Predators had hunted them in the darkness. They had survived not through strength but through stubbornness and spite, refusing to die when all logic said they should. This was the core of human nature, and any negotiation must acknowledge it. Meanwhile, Ambassador prepared for her second appearance before the council. She had spent the night reading reports and talking with experts back on Earth. She needed to make these aliens understand something that words alone could not convey. She needed to show them the truth of human history. The council chamber was even more crowded than before. Word had spread about the confrontation with the new species, and representatives from distant worlds had traveled to witness what happened next. Felt the pressure of their attention as she walked to the platform. She carried no weapons and wore no armor. Her only shield was the story she had come to tell. Counselor opened the session and asked if she had anything to add to her previous statements. General sat in his section with arms crossed, waiting for her to fail. The other representatives whispered among themselves, placing bets on how this would end. None of them expected what came next. Began to speak about Earth. She described a world of beauty and danger, a planet that tested every creature that lived upon its surface. She told them about the dinosaurs, the mighty beasts that had ruled for millions of years before being wiped out by a rock from space. She explained that humanity's ancestors had been small and weak, hiding in burrows while monsters walked above them. But those small creatures had survived when the giants died. They had crawled out from their holes and inherited a world transformed by fire and ash. Over millions of years, they had grown smarter and stronger, learning to use tools and language and fire. They had spread across the earth, adapting to every environment from frozen tundras to burning deserts. Spoke of the ice ages that had nearly ended human existence. Glaciers a mile thick had covered the land and food had become scarce. Entire tribes had perished in the cold, but some had survived by becoming harder than the ice itself. They had learned to hunt mammoths and build shelters from bone and hide. They had refused to surrender to the frozen world. She told them about the plagues that swept through human cities, diseases that killed half the population in a single generation, the Black Death that turned Europe into a graveyard, the fevers that came from distant lands and destroyed empires. Each time humanity had been brought to its knees, and each time it had risen again. The chamber was silent now. Even General listened with something approaching respect. Spoke of human wars, not to glorify them but to explain them. She described the endless cycles of conflict that had shaped her species, the battles fought over land and resources and ideas. She admitted that humans had done terrible things to each other. They had invented weapons of mass destruction and come within minutes of ending their own civilization. But they had also learned from their mistakes. They had built systems to prevent the worst impulses from taking control. She told them about the first time humans had split the atom. They had created a weapon that could destroy cities in a single flash. For decades they had lived in fear that someone would use those weapons and end everything. But they had held back. They had chosen survival over annihilation because that was what humans did best. Then she spoke directly to Counselor. She asked him how many of the species in this room had faced extinction. She asked how many had survived ice ages and plagues and the threat of nuclear fire. She asked how many had clawed their way up from prey animals to reach the stars through nothing but will and determination. The silence was her answer. Told them that humans built the Defiant because they expected the universe to be hostile. That was all they had ever known. Every generation had faced threats that should have ended them, and every generation had found a way to survive. The ship was not a sign of aggression, but a monument to their refusal to die quietly. Counselor asked what would happen if the council demanded surrender. His voice was softer now, touched by something that might have been understanding. Smiled sadly. She said that humans did not know how to surrender. It was not in their nature. They could be killed, but they could not be conquered. They could be broken, but they would always rebuild. If the council wanted war, humanity would fight until the last ship burned and the last soldier fell. And even then, even from the ashes, something would survive to rise again. She stepped back from the platform and waited. She had said everything she came to say. Now the fate of her people rested in alien hands. She hoped they had understood. General was not convinced by speeches. He had led armies across 100 worlds and conquered species that had begged for mercy. Words were wind to him. What mattered was power, raw and undeniable. If these humans wanted respect, they would have to earn it the old way. He stood before the council and demanded a demonstration. Let the humans prove their claims about their mighty warship. Let them show what their weapons could do against rock and stone. If they were as powerful as they claimed, they should have nothing to fear. If they were bluffing, the council would know and could act accordingly. Ambassador carried the request back to the Defiant. Captain Daniel listened carefully and then contacted Admiral Monroe on Earth. They spent an hour discussing the risks. A demonstration would reveal their capabilities to potential enemies. It would show the council exactly what they were dealing with, but refusing might be seen as weakness, and weakness invited aggression. In the end, they agreed. The Defiant would show a fraction of what she could do, enough to impress but not enough to reveal everything. They would hold back their most powerful weapons and hope it would be enough. The council arranged for the demonstration to take place in a remote asteroid field. 12 alien vessels accompanied the Defiant, their sensors recording everything. General watched from his flagship with his arms crossed and doubt in his eyes. He had seen many species boast of their strength. Most of them had disappointed him. Commander Lisa Grant coordinated the crew as they prepared for the show. Lieutenant ran final checks on the weapon systems. He was a quiet man who took pride in his work, treating the instruments of destruction with the same care a musician might give to a violin. Everything was functioning at peak efficiency. Captain gave the order to begin. The first targets were asteroids the size of small mountains. The Defiants opened fire, accelerating metal slugs to a fraction of light speed. The projectiles crossed the void in an instant and struck the rocks with force beyond imagination. The asteroids did not crack or crumble. They exploded into clouds of gravel, the impacts releasing energy that made nearby sensors flare white. General leaned forward in his seat. His species had developed technology centuries ago, but nothing on this scale. The human weapons fired faster and hit harder than anything he had seen. The second phase targeted a cluster of larger asteroids. The Defiant's plasma cannons came to life, streams of superheated matter that burned brighter than stars. 3 asteroids vanished simultaneously, vaporized into expanding clouds of gas. The heat was so intense that smaller rocks nearby began to glow and soften. The watching aliens exchanged nervous glances, their transmissions filled with chatter as they tried to understand what they were seeing. Some insisted it must be a trick. Others began calculating how many ships they would need to match such firepower. Daniel ordered the third phase. Nuclear missiles launched from the Defiant's bays, their engines carrying them toward a formation of asteroids in the distance. The warheads detonated in sequence, blossoming into spheres of fire that pushed against the darkness. The force of the explosions shifted the orbits of nearby rocks, sending them tumbling away in new directions. General was no longer leaning forward. He was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his claws had left marks in the metal. The final demonstration was one that Daniel had hesitated to approve. The graviton lance was the Defiant's main weapon, a device that manipulated the fundamental forces of the universe. It had never been used in combat and had only been tested twice in human space. But if they were going to make an impression, This was the way to do it. The target was an asteroid the size of a small moon. It tumbled slowly through the field, a mountain of rock and iron that had drifted through space since the birth of the galaxy. The Defiant positioned herself carefully, her bow pointed directly at the target. The lance fired. There was no beam of light, no flash of energy. Space itself seemed to twist and fold around the asteroid. The rock began to compress, collapsing inward as gravity suddenly became impossibly strong at its core. In less than 3 seconds, the entire asteroid had been crushed into a point smaller than a grain of sand. Then even that point vanished, consumed by forces that broke the laws of normal physics. A singularity bloomed in the darkness, a hole in space that bent light around itself. It lasted only a moment before evaporating in a burst of radiation. But in that moment, the watching aliens understood exactly what humanity had created. They had built a weapon that could make black holes. General's transmission came through on all channels. His voice had lost its earlier arrogance. He wanted to know how many of these ships humanity possessed. Daniel kept his face calm as he answered. He told them that the Defiant was their first TitanClass warship, but that 17 more were currently under construction in shipyards across human space. He did not mention that most of those ships were still years from completion. He did not mention that the Graviton Lance had drained nearly a quarter of the Defiant's power reserves with a single shot. Some truths were better left unspoken. The silence that followed stretched for a long time. The alien vessels began to withdraw, pulling back from the Defiant as if she might turn her weapons on them at any moment. General's flagship was the last to leave, the massive dreadnought seeming almost small as it retreated into the distance. Ambassador joined Captain on the bridge. She asked him what he thought would happen now. Daniel looked out at the stars and admitted he did not know. They had shown the Council what humanity could do. Now the question was how the Council would respond. They had made their point. They had demonstrated that humanity was not a species to be bullied or threatened. But power was only part of the equation. What came next would require different weapons entirely. Words and wisdom and the hope that somewhere in this vast galaxy there were beings who valued peace as much as humans did. The Defiant turned and began the journey back to the station. Whatever happened next, the universe would never see humanity the same way again. The Council met in emergency session for 3 days. Representatives argued and debated until their voices grew hoarse. Alliances that had stood for centuries threatened to crumble as species took sides on the human question. Some demanded immediate war, insisting that these dangerous newcomers must be destroyed before they grew any stronger. Others counseled patience, suggesting that humanity might be useful as allies against future threats. General addressed the assembly with none of his usual bluster. The demonstration had changed something in him. He had spent his life believing that the hegemony was the greatest military power in the galaxy. Now he knew that a species barely out of its infancy had surpassed them in ways that mattered. He told the Council that war with humanity would be costly beyond measure. They might win in the end through sheer numbers, but the price would be counted in billions of lives and hundreds of worlds. High Counselor listened to every argument and weighed every opinion. He was old even by the standards of his long-lived species, and he had seen the rise and fall of empires. Something about the humans intrigued him. They were violent and dangerous, yes, but there was also something else. A spark of determination that reminded him of the ancient founders who had built the Council in the first place. On the 3rd day, made a decision that surprised everyone. He announced that he would travel to the human warship personally and speak with their captain. He would go alone except for the human ambassador, placing his life in their hands as a gesture of trust. Many protested, but he would not be moved. If humanity was to join the galaxy, it would not be as enemies or subjects. It would be as equals or not at all. The shuttle carried an ambassador across the void to the Defiant, watched the old alien as they approached the massive ship. She could not read his expressions, but something in his posture suggested deep thought. He had ruled over hundreds of species for 2 centuries. Now he was about to meet the addition to his domain. Captain Daniel waited for them in the observation deck. It was a large chamber with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of the stars that took the breath away. He had chosen this location deliberately. He wanted the counselor to see what humanity saw when they looked at the universe. Not enemies or resources, but possibilities beyond counting. Entered the room and stopped. His 3 eyes moved slowly across the star field, taking in the sight. He had traveled through space for centuries but rarely stopped to simply look at it. The view from this deck reminded him of something he had almost forgotten: wonder. Daniel stepped forward and welcomed the counselor to his ship. He offered refreshments that the medical staff had confirmed were safe for consumption. They sat together in comfortable chairs while translated their words. Those grasp of English was improving by the hour. The counselor spoke first. He admitted that humanity frightened the council, not just because of their weapons but because of what they represented. The galaxy had grown comfortable in its routines. Wars happened, but they followed predictable patterns. Resources were divided according to ancient agreements. Nothing truly new had emerged in thousands of years. Then humanity appeared, a species that had fought its way up from nothing, building weapons that rivaled the greatest powers without any help or guidance. They were proof that the universe could still surprise the council, that their control was not as complete as they believed. This was more disturbing to many than any number of warships. Daniel nodded slowly. He understood what was saying. Humanity had been surprised too when they discovered the council. They had expected either empty space or hostile monsters. Finding a civilized galaxy with laws and treaties and diplomatic processes was almost harder to accept than enemies would have been. Asked what humanity wanted, not demands or threats but genuine desires. What did they hope to gain from joining the galactic community? Daniel thought for a long moment before answering. He said that humanity wanted what they had always wanted: safety for their children, room to grow and explore, friends who would stand with them when darkness came. They did not seek conquest or domination. They had tried that on their own world and learned that it only led to suffering. What they wanted was a place in the universe where they could be themselves without fear. The counselor was quiet for a time. Then he spoke about the early days of the council, when a handful of species had come together to end a war that threatened to destroy them all. They had been enemies once, killing each other over territory and resources. But they had learned that cooperation brought more than conflict ever could. Perhaps it was time to remember that lesson. Extended one of his 4 hands in a gesture of greeting. He offered humanity full membership in the Galactic Council, not as a junior partner or a probationary member, but as equals with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. Their strength would help protect what the Council had built. Their fresh perspective might help solve problems that older species had given up on. Ambassador accepted the handshake on behalf of her people. She felt tears forming in her eyes but did not try to hide them. This was the moment she had worked toward without even knowing it. All her years of negotiation and diplomacy had led to this single handclasp between species. Daniel watched the exchange and allowed himself a small smile. They had come to the stars expecting monsters and found neighbors instead. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be conflicts and misunderstandings and moments when the alliance seemed ready to break. But for now, in this moment, humanity had taken its place among the stars. 10 years later, when the Devourer swarm emerged from the galactic core, it was Admiral Daniel who led the defense. His fleet of Titan-class warships held the line while other species evacuated their populations. The battle raged for months across 1,000 systems and many good beings died. But in the end, humanity's terrible weapons found their true purpose. Not conquest but protection, not destruction but salvation. In council chambers across the galaxy, a new saying spread from world to world: when darkness comes, call the humans. They were born in a universe that tried to kill them at every turn. They were forged in ice and fire and blood. They survived when others fell, and they never, ever surrendered. They were humanity, and they had finally found their place among the stars.